started as any normal day would do. And getting on the E train, I was headed to the church. I was going to check in at the church and then head on down to Lower Manhattan for a meeting that I was supposed to have with someone down near the Trade Center. And so I was headed down that way. But the train stopped as we got into Manhattan, and we all were told to exit. And when we exited, everybody was on their phones trying to get a hold of, or find out what was going on and why the trains were stopping. But nobody could get anything because all the lines were tied up. And so I headed on to the church. And as I came in the door, I was met by Marty, who let me know what was happening. The TV was on, and everybody was praying. But the day quickly changed, and we just started doing what we always do when there's a need. Found ways to do it. People were very concerned, and it wasn't like, well, let's just act like nothing was going on. It was like something major has happened, and we can all get really scared and panicky, or we can go into a mode which is, how can we be of assistance? What can we do? And that was a real frustrating piece, because there was no idea of what anybody could do, because we didn't know the extent of what was happening. And then Marty had already begun putting up signs, or had sent out people to put up signs around the Port Authority because the buses weren't running, to say that anybody could come in and rest. And so crowds quickly began to move to the church. Metro didn't do anything out of the ordinary for Metro. We just did what Metro always does, and that was be community. Being a community, we immersed ourselves in the community and provided community. We couldn't do much more than that. We said, what have we got? Let's offer what we've got, and not worry about what we can't do. Let's just do with what we can. So it was a regular day. And that says, I hate to say that, but it was it was doing what we always did, just on a different scale. But primarily Ronnie, Marty, and Tony, Courtney, Barbara, and Anita Massengill. That is a crew. Each of them had their own issues to deal with. Each of us did. I didn't know where my kids were scattered as well. But they dealt with those, but not in such a way that they forgot to provide community for those in need. I mean, that there were others. Hebrews 13:3 talks about remembering the prisoner, remembering those who are less fortunate. And it was a sense that day that everybody sort of was on the same. We all were remembering not only our own concerns, but we were remembering the needs of the other, because the needs of the other were the same as ours. Some random guy from Richmond, Virginia area, a businessman who was stuck, who was Baptist, who had heard about us at some point in time, stopped in. I have no idea who he was. But we had a young man with us, sheltering with us, who was highly anxious on some anxiety medication that was locked inside the bus terminal now, because he had it in there, and he was just panicking. He was going crazy. And Barbara worked with the young man to get information about his prescription. And then this guy from Virginia walked all over Manhattan north of the church looking for a pharmacy to fill that prescription, to bring the kid his medicines back. And I never saw this guy again. But he came, and that was something he could do. he found a way to offer what he could. He walked miles, to get guys medicine and paid for it and then disappeared. And I don't know who he was, but he's one of the guys. The other piece was the way the people who were taking refuge providing comfort for one another. It's like, we will get through this. This is interrupted where we're going. It was the family of Kurdish refugees, Muslim refugees or Arabic refugees. I don't know if they were Muslim, they were Kurds, who were on their way to the Midwest to a church that was going to house them or resettle them. Didn't speak any English. And the kids from the Israeli kibbutz who could speak a little bit of Arabic, and were able to communicate in Jew and Arab. I mean, was the fact that we were a Polish church with Polish iconic art all over the place provided a bit of comfort for the Russian Orthodox families that were inside the church. It was just that whole dynamic of the way it became sort of a small microcosm of the peaceable kingdom. It will always stick with me.
In August 2000, I did something that seemed like a good idea at the time. We moved from Jersey City to a beautiful apartment in downtown Manhattan on the corner of Broadway and Maiden Lane. As a result, we spent most of September and October of 2001 living in hotel rooms. That first week in October, I went to Washington, D.C. for my first meeting as a member of the board of directors of the Baptist Joint Committee. There was going to be a time for us to say something about who we were. I thought I should write it out to be careful. Now, rather than try to reconstruct from my memories today what happened 15 years ago, I'm going to read part of what I told the board that day. My name is David, and I am homeless, temporarily, but I will be home soon. Home is 1 block east of what was the World Trade Center. The last time my family and I slept at home was Monday, September 10. The next morning, my daughter and I left early for Midtown Manhattan. But at 8:25 a.m., my wife and 11-year-old son were standing in front of 5 World Trade Center, hailing a cab to take him to his school in Greenwich Village. She dropped him off and walked to the nearest subway station. She was going to take the number 1 train back home to the subway station in the basement of the World Trade Center, a station that no longer exists. But when she got to the subway entrance, people were standing and staring downtown at the gaping hole in one of the towers and the smoke pouring from it. While she watched, she saw the second plane hit and a fireball bursting from that tower. She turned north and took the subway to our church, Metro Baptist. Since then, I have pondered God's mercies. And what a difference a mere 20 minutes either way in her schedule could have made in our lives. We spent that night at our pastor's house, but the next day I headed back downtown. See, our dog and 2 cats had been left in the apartment without food or water since my wife was only going to be away a half hour. I didn't know what I could do, so I just started walking south from 14th Street. The wind was blowing from the south, and it was bitter with smoke. By the time I reached Canal, most people were wearing masks. There were police checkpoints every block. But because I had photo identification showing that I lived there, and because police have a fond spot for dogs, they let me through. The last 4 blocks, I had a National Guardsman with a rifle on his shoulder by my side as an escort. Those last few blocks were hard. It was late afternoon on a sunny day, but there it was twilight. Everything was covered with an inch or so of gray ash. Everything, that is, except for a carpet of papers on the ground. I had to walk on them. And as I did, I saw letters, memos, bills, all of the paper that makes up an office. But there was no office anymore. And every 3rd or 4th page was partly burned. When I went into our apartment, I was shocked. It was untouched. The lights were on, there was running water. It was as if time had stopped that Tuesday morning. I was able to take care of the animals as best I could, and then went reluctantly back into the world after September 11. I walked into a war zone, but I knew this war zone. It was where I spent most of the last 20 years of my life. When you are a Wall Street lawyer, you get to know the area around Wall Street very well. But that afternoon, everything was different. I really didn't know this place. As I walked away, the radios went off around me with an emergency warning. One of the remaining buildings in the World Trade Center was collapsing behind me. It has been 3 weeks. The debris is still burning, but we are going home. It will be a very different place. It is a different world. While I wait to go home, I have done a lot of thinking about what I saw. One of the most important things was the invisible city. See, we have heard sermons about building up treasure in heaven, but we can build up treasure on earth. A treasure that is harder to destroy than any building. In New York City, that treasure has been obscured by giant buildings. But you saw it on September 11th. You saw it when world-class chefs were serving gourmet food under makeshift tents to rescue workers. When steel workers came from every construction site in the city without a call. When firefighters charged into burning buildings that were raining flaming debris. You saw it in the following days as plays went back on and our churches filled. You saw a city that no terrorist could destroy. A city built of creativity and freedom. A city based on an overwhelming belief in the value of human talent. In the 15 years since I wrote that, I have seen that city time after time. In blackouts, when a plane landed in the river, when Sandy hit. And each time New Yorkers, without being told to do it, got together and helped each other make it through. That's still the secret of being a real New Yorker. It's not how big your building is. It's whether you care about the people around you when things get really bad. That city is still here. And no matter what the fearmongers say, no one from outside our city is going to destroy it.
I visited New York like January of 2001. Enamored, love, George Steinway. I decided. I almost bought a New York City area code cell phone like on that visit, but I didn't. So I want to come to New York. I've essentially been offered a job. So I'm waiting on my birthday, 9/11, for my, I think, third and final call because I arrogantly turned them down before. I was like, you can do better. I was on the phone with one of my best friends. I called her just a little after 9 o'clock, admonishing in tone, like, why wouldn't you call me on my birthday? And then she said, you should probably turn on the TV. Something's going on, and I don't know what it is. Well, she worked at Morgan Stanley, Midtown. She had turned down a job that came up at the World Trade Center. And then, the world closes in. A couple days later, I got the call. I didn't care what the offer was. I said yes. So about 10 days later, I was in a rental car on my way to New York. My apartment fell through. I got a call from whoever it was that was subletting or some suspicious changing of tenant, imagine. It fell through, so I didn't have a place to stay. I was getting to New York, expletives or high water. I was getting there. So I knew a classmate of mine from high school had gone to NYU and was living in, I didn't know where. I found out he was in Jersey City Heights. I said, Phil, those people who know, Phil Jeffrey Bond, I said, Phil, I need a couch to crash on for at least a few days while I figure something out, but my apartment fell through. And he's like, no problem, when are you getting in town? So he was great, he put me up. I will always remember that and appreciate that. There's so many, so many little people that help you along the way. And so it was great, he said, good, actually when you get here, we'll be going into Manhattan that day. I forget what day it was. And I said, well, I have no problem with that. I would like to be in Manhattan. I love Jersey City Heights. Let's go to Manhattan. I said, what are we doing? He's like, I'll tell you when you get here. So I got there. And he's always been theatrical. He's done a lot of producing and writing and such. Turns out he was producing a benefit for victims from 9/11. And it's like, really? It was called Arise. It was very dramatic, and I think it was a successful event. They had a great music director for the event. Maybe you've heard of him. Brett Christopherson was at the keys. And it was then and there that I met what were my epicenter of just family in New York. The fourth floor, the ubiquitous fourth floor, everyone knows. The people are amazing, the energy is amazing. And you know what, the next Sunday, I'd never taken a bus from Jersey City Heights to Manhattan. But Port Authority is right across the street. I was like, I'm going to church. So I did. David Waugh would tell me what diner we went to for brunch after church. I don't remember where we are. My dad called my cell phone that day, and I said, guess what? My father was very happy to hear. I have found my church home. And that's how that happened.
First thing I remember about that Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001, was what a beautiful day it was. I had just voted the mayoral primary elections and was walking back to the church and thought, man, what a beautiful day. And I went to my office, began to work, getting ready for the arrival of Shawnee Ball, who is about to come and start working at our church, and also getting ready for a site visit for Park Hill Baptist Church out of Texas, who was coming by our church for a visit. I was in my office and working on the second floor, and Marty Williams, our associate pastor, came in and told me that a plane had just hit World Trade Center. So we went downstairs to see what was going on. We watched, and about that time the group showed up, and so I took them and we watched the television for a moment. Then we got into our group and I began to share with them about the Rauschenbusch Metro Ministries, and about that time Marty came back with a ashen look on her face and said, a second plane has hit, and then obviously we knew that it wasn't a tragic accident, but rather an attack. With that, we dismissed the group and asked them to go back to where they were so they could get back safely, and then we began to decide what to do. And the first thing I did was ran upstairs to make sure that Tony Morgan was okay. Tony worked at the World Trade Center and was a resident staff, and thankfully he was off that day and he was upstairs on the fourth floor. And then we ran back down and had a quick prayer. Our pastor, David Waugh, was down on 14th Street trying to get through, but the government, military and police had shut off the city past 14th Street, and so no one could get by without a government ID. So he came on back, and we made plans, and we just simply said, God, however you want to use our church, then please do. Marty had the brilliant idea of making a sign, and she put it out front, just welcoming anybody that came by. And almost immediately we had people begin to come into our church, and we gave out lots and lots of water. Our fellowship room was filled because we had a television there at that time, and people were standing 2 or 3 deep watching television. And we pulled all of our phones out. People were making phone calls and trying to get hold of the loved ones, let them know they were all right. It was an incredible experience of trying to figure out what to do moment by moment. And we just began to, as Metro does, began to try to seek to meet the community needs at that time. And so, as I said, we gave out a lot of water. We prayed with people. We allowed them to watch the television set. We let them come in just for a respite for a while. Many just came in for a drink and to rest, and then took off and went on down. Immediately we realized we're going to have to feed them lunch, and we have to do a meal. And about that time we heard that the Port Authority had closed down, and then there were thousands of people on the street just milling around, not knowing what to do. That's when we realized we were going to have to provide 24-hour care, so we brought down the mattresses from the 4th floor dorm to fill the sanctuary, and we were full for 24 hours for 3 days, doing breakfast, lunch, dinner, providing security, being there for people, doing what we could to do to help in a typical Metro fashion. I guess what I remember most about that day was the quiet, the eerie quiet among the city. Right outside of our doorsteps on 40th Street, there were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people walking very silently down the street. At that time, the only way off the island was the ferry, and so many people were walking down our street without a sound. By the mid-afternoon, people who had been at the site began to show up, and they had the white dust, and it was very evident that they were a part of the carnage of that area. And they came in, and we fed, we helped wiped off as best we could. We did lots of things, and then they just would be on their way. And so that's one thing I remember the most, is how many people passed by our church, how many people came in to find a welcoming spirit, a place where they could be safe and secure. And over 3 nights, we were open for a rescue for center. And I guess another thing I'll remember is how we responded after 9/11. For many weeks, we offered our dorm space to volunteer teams that came and be a part of the Family Assistance Center over at Pier 94. Many of you remember these volunteer tags we all got as we helped serve the families who had been affected the most by 9/11 through the Family Assistance Center. And many of us were involved in helping out and being a part of that safe haven to give support and help. I guess the most important thing that I'd like to share with you today is that you be very proud to be a Metro member, because people found a way to get there to the church. Members found a way to get there. Subways weren't running, buses weren't running, but they found a way to get to the church to help out the people who had been stranded and who were needing people to care for them, needing food, needing coffee, needing water. And Metro does as they always do. They responded with care, with concern, and with action, very much like they did just a few years later when we had all the electricity go off, when the power shut down. just a few years after that, the Superstorm Sandy. Metro has always been, and even week by week, Metro's always been about community, about care, about concern. It certainly was very evident on 9/11.
My story is probably not so different from many people who were downtown when the planes hit the World Trade Center. I live in the East Village, but was working in southern Manhattan. My sister and I worked there, and by a series of strange plane cancellations and delays, both my mother and father happened to be in town and staying with us on 9/11. We took advantage of that, Kelly, my sister and I, knowing that my parents could look after her little 9-month-old, and we left early for work that day. Took the N train downtown, passes right beside the World Trade Towers, a little bit earlier, maybe an hour earlier than we would have normally. So we got to work that day on at about 8:15, I think. I remember as we were leaving our apartment, my father said, "I think I'm going to reschedule my plane flight for tomorrow rather than today. And tonight we'll all go out and celebrate your birthday, Roger." Yes, like Mark Britt, my birthday is 9/11. And I thought that was great. And we got to work. It was pretty empty. At our work, you don't have to be there till 9:30, so the place was pretty empty. Kelly went down to the subfloors of our 40-floor building to prepare a training. I went to the 29th floor where I worked, and I was in an office where I was a large room with many, many desks, but I was the only one there. And at some point, before 9 o'clock, my friend who works in the library stopped in, poked his head in the door and said, "Roger, you might want to come out and look. I think a plane has hit the World Trade Center." And I was very busy, and I had visions in my mind of the plane that the little prop plane that had hit the Empire State Building not so many years before. And although I was curious, I didn't go. I stayed there at my desk working. About 15 minutes later, my friend Brian stopped in again. I was still the only one in this office, and he said that, "Roger, I think we need to get out of the building. It's terrorist." He didn't mention a second plane. He just said the word terrorist, and so I don't know why, but I immediately picked up the phone, called my parents, asked them if they were watching television. They said no. I said, "Well, you might want to turn the TV on. Someone just stopped in here and said there's terrorists at the World Trade Center, and I need to go downstairs. I'll find Kelly, and we'll, if they're going to let us go, I'll head on home." So I'm the fire warden for the 27th floor, so who knows why, but I went to the 27th floor and knocked on all the offices and the conference rooms and make sure that everybody knew that something had happened at the World Trade Centers. I didn't really know what, but I said there seems to be some, I saw a few people, and I said there seems to be some need to go to the first floor, and told them, and they went on down to the first floor. I got down there, looked for my sister, eventually found her. It was I don't want to over exaggerate this. It wasn't real bedlam. It was just hundreds of people in the lobby of our building, crowded, trying to figure out what they're going to do next. The question everyone seemed to be asking at the time is, do we get to go home? Do we stay? You have to remember back then, not everyone had the cell phones with the internet on it. Matter of fact, I think probably more than anybody else, no one knew what was going on. We had a taxi cab that pulled up in front of our building and had parked, and he'd opened all 4 of his doors, and he was playing the radio as loud as he could. And that was really our source of information. And people kept coming, which I'm still unclear on how they were getting there, but kept coming to our building to work. And so at one point we probably had 300 people. And nobody knew what to do, but the security finally said, "You know what, everyone needs to get out of the lobby and onto the plaza of our building." And they're pushing us onto the plaza of our building. And there we were for probably 30 or 40 minutes. And again, it's crowded and people don't, everyone, all of a sudden you have the alpha types trying to take charge. So you've got people yelling over here and people yelling over there, but really no idea what to do. And soot. And at this point, I'm pretty dense, but I still did not know that a second plane had hit a trade tower. I could look up, I could see things. And at this point, we were on the south side of the tower, and the black soot from the plane going into the tower had started to descend in our area and blow into our area. So you now have 300 people being covered with these black flakes and soot, and people are coughing. And that's when people got a little bit nervous and confused, and people who had asthma were demanding to get back into the building, and it sort of was bedlam. And eventually somebody stood up, whether they had the authority to do this or not, and said, if you can get home from here, you should leave and make your way home. Well, Kelly and I live about an hour's walk from work in the East Village, and when we heard that, we went around and wrote our address and phone numbers on lots of pieces of paper and gave them to a lot of people there on the plaza that we knew. I had temps working for me. I didn't know them very well, but I said, telling people if they need to come to our house that they certainly could. And then we headed home. I probably should have told you that when the guy came to tell me that it was terrorists, preceding that, I'd heard this blood-curdling scream, the shouting of no, 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 and I had started to get up when he stepped in and said it was terrorists. When I went out to go to the 27th floor to make sure everyone was okay, a woman had collapsed on the floor, and my friend Brian and another man were helping her to the elevator to take her down. And that has always been sort of a seminal point for me, and realizing something serious, but I didn't know what. Something very serious was happening. We headed north. We are south of the tower. We're heading north to get to the East Village, to our place. We had not walked very far. We were pretty much parallel, a couple blocks from the towers, when we were covered with white dust. We had no idea what it was, really didn't know where it had come from. You see those dramatic pictures of the dust rolling down the street, but for us, we were up against a building perpendicular to where the dust was coming from, so all we knew is we were covered with white dust. And heavy enough that initially you couldn't see more than a foot in front of you. So I grabbed my sister and we stepped inside a doorway of a store that was closed, trying to figure out what we were going to do. The dust subsided pretty quickly to where you could see 8 to 10 feet in front of you, and you started seeing people running this way and that way. Surprisingly, more people running downtown than uptown. It was very confusing. And a guy jumped into the doorway with us, and he told us that the Brooklyn Bridge had been bombed and was no longer there. He also told us that the White House had been destroyed, and so had the Capitol building. Now, he seemed like an alarmist, but we're in the midst of a white cloud that we don't know where it's come from. We've been told that the Brooklyn Bridge we're starting to think maybe this cloud is from the bombing of the Brooklyn Bridge. And for a few moments there, I thought, well, this is what it's like to be in a war zone. We are apparently under attack. And we really weren't sure what to do. His story was somewhat validated by the fact that very quickly, but we were only at this point 2 to 3 blocks from the World Trade Tower, people covered completely in white are walking by us, and except for where they've been hurt and are bleeding. And so you'd see these white figures walking by you with blood coming down their arms or on their knees. The one man that sticks in particular in my mind was a man that was still carrying his briefcase. He was in a suit. He was completely covered in white, but he had blood running from his head down his face and onto his suit. Kelly and I, we got our wits about it to stop him and ask if we could help him. Yeah, he seemed somewhat stunned. He said he was going to the ferry. We said, well, the Staten Island ferry has been canceled. He seemed a little perturbed with it. He said, not that ferry, and he walked away. But in our minds, we still thought, well, this is, what do we do? Do we head back to work? Do we go on to home? We don't want to head towards the Brooklyn Bridge. It's just been bombed and it's gone. So we do a rather stupid thing in hindsight, but we walk towards the towers to get around the Brooklyn Bridge entrance and to head north. And we got by it, and as we were entering the lower part of Chinatown, it was much like Ronnie said in his video, the wind blowing the way it was, all of a sudden it was again a beautiful, clear day. And we're in Chinatown, and we're up alongside buildings. And at this point, we don't know that a building has collapsed. And we are rounding a corner, and this kid is running towards us saying, run, run, the tower's collapsing, or the building's collapsing, or it's falling. And all of a sudden, here come, I don't want to exaggerate, dozens, maybe 100, mostly Chinese Americans running down the street towards us. Again, we find ourselves heading the direction no one else is, and they are running hard, and I pulled Kelly, we got between two cars, and people ran past us. And at that moment, I had sort of another thought, well, is this what it feels like to be meeting your maker? I really had no idea the proximity of the towers. People are running. I knew we weren't going to run. We just stood there and we waited. The people ran past us, and then people started slowing down, and we were fine, and we started to head north again. When we got to Canal Street, she and I turned around, and we were trying to figure out, there was a lot of smoke down there. And we're thinking, even with all this smoke, from this vantage point, we should be able to see the towers. And at that point, we realized perhaps the towers were no longer there. Through all this, if you know me, I don't talk in monotone a lot, but I think to keep myself calm, Kelly said I talked in this monotone voice, kept saying, let's move forward, let's move forward. We stopped I thought we might need money. We stopped at a bank machine, and it worked. We stopped at a phone booth, and it didn't work. We stopped at a bodega to buy Jonah like formula and things we thought he would eat. We were sort of in, I don't know what, some sort of emergency mode. And we got home, and I think I must have been holding a lot within, because once we got in and saw Jonah, saw my parents, and Kelly and I both broke down in tears and cried for quite a while. But needing to do something, my father and I, we filled buckets with water and went out to the street and had paper cups and handed out water to people as the hordes of people now are walking from downtown, hundreds of people. And though very few people took our water from these very suspect-looking buckets, we did have several people stop and cry with us. It was really the first time we got the feeling the first time they'd really talked to anyone as they were heading up, and that went on. Eventually made our way back to apartment, and for the first time really watching the TV, kind of had an idea of what had happened. We did that through, like everyone else, I guess, into the evening. Late that evening, the phone rang, surprising to us all, because we had tried to use it many times to call people to let them know we were okay. And it was my brother on the line. Now, I would find out later that he had been trying from morning until that time, 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, sitting at his kitchen table, dialing my number, then dialing my sister's number, dialing my number and sister's number. He's probably the most stoic, unemotional person I know, but when he picked up the phone, I said hello, and he sounded startled, and he said, "Is this Roger?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "Are you okay?" And then he went through, is Kelly okay? Is Jonah okay? Is Mom okay? Is Dad okay? And I said, yes. And then I just heard this bellowing, sobbing from my brother, much like the woman earlier today in the office. And I talked to his wife for a few minutes, hung up, told my folks that Jonah was a little that Jay, my brother, was a little emotional, but he knows we're okay. And my father turned to me and said, "Oh yeah, Roger, happy birthday."
I don't really remember lots of specifics about what we did and exactly what happened. I do remember very vividly learning about the Flight 93 flight and my friend who was on that flight who passed away. And I found that out on CNN. And I had seen him the Saturday before everything happened, and he told me he was going to San Francisco on Monday morning, right? And it turns out, I found this out much later, but he was sick on Monday morning, so he went on Tuesday morning instead. And I didn't know that it had happened, and that's how I found out. And I remember that being kind of I had this sort of really palpable sense of sadness and dread for all the lives that were lost. And I kept thinking how terrible it must be for people who've lost people. But when I found that out from CNN, it was ridiculous. It was amazing. But there was so much of that whole week that was a blur, and I only remember it's sort of like looking at an impressionist painting rather than looking at HD. I have kind of hazy recollections of moments and times that were really important and that will always stay with me. But if I try to remember really sharp specifics, I have trouble with that. And that's normally not something that I can say. I usually do remember details. I had gotten a call like probably a minute before that from a friend who knew that I normally would be headed to work about that time, and he called. He's Croatian, and so if I were sitting talking to him in front of my face, I couldn't understand some of the things he would say sometimes, right? But he was yelling into the phone, and I couldn't understand what he was saying, and he was like, "Don't go to the office, where are you?" And I said, "I'm in my bathroom, I haven't even gotten to the shower yet." I was planning on going in, but I was going in late because we had, as you said, we had that Jeopardy party where I lost miserably. I got third place in Jeopardy. That's important for me to note, I guess. But we stayed up late, kind of celebrating. We ended up kind of going out afterward and got home late, and I was exhausted, And so he's calling, he's yelling. I couldn't really tell exactly what he was saying, but it was something like, "Don't go to work, turn on the TV, don't go to," and Ronnie came in like a minute after that, and it was all this blur of, I didn't understand what was going on. I turned on the TV, Ronnie came in, and he told me what had happened, and from that point, it was sort of like, seeing it's like time slowed down. We were watching things happen. When the second plane hit, we were actually watching the Today Show. I remember Katie Couric talking about it, and I think Matt Lauer was on there too. I don't remember. But when it happened, we watched it live, but I thought that they were replaying a different angle from the first plane. And so the horror and the kind of surreality of that still for a while. I immediately tried to call my mom, right, in Tennessee, to let her know that I was okay, because she had been visiting New York in August of that year. I took her to my office. We went on the E train to the World Trade Center, and then walked across the plaza there between the World Trade Center and the World Financial Center. And so I know that she knew exactly what my path was to get there. So I was trying to call her. We couldn't call out cell phones after I received that one call. I don't think we were able to call anyone until like noon or something like that. And when I heard her voice, I completely imploded, and it was just all this sort of sadness and anger and disbelief, and I just sat there and just screamed, crying when I was on the phone with her, but not before that. I don't know if it's one of those things like you can hold it together until you hear your mom's voice after you've had a car accident or something, and there's this massive release of all of that stuff pent up. Well, first of all, since my office was in the World Financial Center, right, I knew I wasn't going to get back down there for any time soon. And the first night, I stayed up all night just because I couldn't go to sleep. But it also just ended up working out well that I would be the person who was the night person, right? And so I stayed up all night just to make sure that the people who were sleeping in the sanctuary were okay. Some people stayed in that little side room watching CNN with me the whole time, and it just sort of worked out that I ended up being the night person every night. And I was still sleeping a little bit, but not very well for for quite a while after that, actually. But I would just be the person who was there all night, and a couple of times other people would be there at certain points during the night, and we just kind of sat there, and I stayed awake in so far as I was able, and if people needed things, or if there was anything that questions that they had, or any ways we could help, we would help them. I mean, in the middle of the night, it was a little bit more limited and a lot quieter, but it was a lot of just watching. But basically, at Metro, it was a lot of just being present and making sure that everything was okay for the people who were still stranded there. And there were people, I don't remember exactly who ended up being there the longest before being able to get out, but there's several people who were there multiple days, and we were just we were there with them. It was good. The sort of psychic trauma that I was experiencing for myself was kind of buffered by the fact that I had stuff I needed to do for other people, and that there were people there who were right in front of my face and who needed something very meager that I was able to offer, that we were all able to offer them. And there wasn't any big evangelical agenda other than just being present and helping people out. And it wasn't any different than anything we would have ever done at Metro. I mean, that's sort of the ethos of the place, right? That church has been that way for a long time, and it wasn't a big surprise that it happened. I look back at it as a special time, but in the context of everything else that happens at Metro Baptist Church in Rauschenbusch, it's sort of what we do, right?
There are emotions and reactions that I too felt at the time and still feel. Fear, horror, bewilderment, confusion, but also compassion and the sense of humanity, that humanity under threat is humanity that comes together, that must come together.
That regardless of our ethnic background, our nationalities, our religious background, we all suffered together that day. In times of crisis, we suffered together. And in times of crisis, people come together and work for the common good. And if we can do that in times of crisis, we should be able to do it in times of no crisis. It was a prophetic kind of time. This is what it could be like. It could be like this. And then it always seems to question, well, then why the hell isn't it?
Service that I do for other people, the putting of other before self happens as just a mundane choice of everyday life, and not something that necessarily has to be brought on by some massive crisis, right? I hope that the way that I treat others and the way that I prioritize my own wants and needs reflects that.
An open door. People who need to just stop. They need to pray, see people, sit down, have a drink of water, cry. And I'd like to think that I grew just from being a part of Metro and hearing the stories of letting people just be people. You don't know how you're going to react. You don't know how you're going to respond. You don't know what you're going to need. You really don't. And you don't have any idea what you can do to help people. And you may not never know that you did. But I promise, a look, a touch, a smile, I mean, it can really fill a heart.